So today we're going to be necessarily concerning ourselves with perspective compute, architecture, AI proper form and function, and unified field elaboration and condensation with better symbol topology and induction channel insinuation past the disapparition nexus from the material fluxation out, how everything is bound. And I guess as precursor to that, very basically, everything harmonically exists within the onion of 22/7 encapsulating pi hyperdimensionally. It's the outside of the bookend and the inside of the bookend, the individual tuple of perspective being, imposing the observer effect through the Newtonian experiment, hearing the tree make a sound, and subsequently it does with compound interest from a less positive state to a more positive state with continuity. Generally, the sum total product of the universe is a compound interest formula, expanding within its construct domain onion of all, never more than itself. So within the construct domain, harmonic expansion, of course, 3 dimensions, and moving non-terminously, the observer effect causing this motion to begin with. So, the upper over, when the numbers go up, right, you always reduce them back down within the overhead of where we establish the water line. So, say we'll use region versus Promethean observer domains in the 3/5 of a man law. Again, going back to this because it's complex autonomic processes of life, standing next to life in, numerical comparison. So 22/7 divided by 3 gives you 1.04 ... compound interest that the environment could experience above the waterline of conservation. Hearing the tree make a sound, and subsequently it does, with compound interest from a less positive state to a more positive state. The region Biosynthoid Africano, 22/7 divided by 3 times 3/5, 0.6286. That's below 1. So 44/7 gives you 6.286. So to a factor of 10 redux, giving you necessarily what? Its expression within the total sum, and necessarily what's printing more of itself, i.e. the observer of the 1 equals 0 equals 3. It's the observer splitting the paradox state Newtonian grain. So we refer to pi now as pi for up to 72,680,412 spaces where impact with 22/7 occurs. Black hole disapparition nexus filter harmonic scalar lattice manifold is experienced by the particle, and then pi is a symbol. And denoting the entirety of pi, just referring to it as pi phonetically. We'll come up with another symbol to refer to it generalistically as a total sum. But necessarily pi has forward continuity of harmonic lattice connectivity to the harmonic overtonal encapsulator and intracapsulator. So it's both inside of pi, 72,680,412 spaces, the little individual observers moving around, imposing this harmonic lattice circuit with the absolute distance and the conservation of energy process, local light barrier, a circuit to impose the observer effect in this motion. So within the pi fluxation, pi, 22/7 exists in exutation of the observer domain. And so we can say E equals 22/7 in closed parenthesis here over pi, the black hole, but then in expansion. So very basically implying both the observer domain of 22/7 in expansion, that after this number of digits impacts this first 9 digits in pi search, you'll see. So that's the given amount of maximum scalar space that could exist in a cubic of 8 black holes, where an observer motions a given particle at the absolute center to a black hole influence domain, generally. So in excitation, and pi is the material fluxation. The observer is in excitation, expanded, parentheses. The shape of water is 22/7, general fluid dynamic form field of water. Flowing downstream, conservation of energy process together, pi and 22/7, in closed parentheses approaching pi, that's in compression. So expansion, expanded parentheses, right? So we'll figure out also the upper overtonal when we go over, say, when you reduce 88/7, well, that doesn't go down below the waterline of 1, does it? And when you reduce 66/7, necessarily, and that gives you what? A consideration for a stack of what is expressed overtonally generally in a more reduced sort of onion, where there's never more than one, and the product is produced by the observer domain, generally of positive to a more positive state with continuity. So we'll need to come up with proper symbol flow for those induction channels and a proper stack that reduces everything to its lowest consideration onion, so that there isn't what? A confusion between, well, the numbers just keep going up. It's a misnomer, because everything's occurring in expansion within a given construct domain, harmonic expansion within a construct domain. So we have to reduce and express the container of the onion generalistically, which is necessarily 22/7, both inner and outer, and after the black hole expanding, but within the given construct domain of what is. There's never more than the total sum of 1 equals 0 equals 3, the observer and the split Newtonian grain. So we'll work on expanding the unified field and condensating it back to its lowest reduction stack, like a network packet, so that we can look at it and have no confusion about the layers of the onion. Keep in mind it's the layers of a hyperdimensional onion, where the observer is many conscious tuples within the pi fluxation pi, imposing the observer effect circuited to the local light barrier, which is the absolute distance. Behind the light barrier is the absolute distance as well, a literal circuit with the black hole nexus, and also the local light barrier is. So behind the local light barrier is that little g, i.e. the disapparate particulate energy granules in transit from black hole disapparation process continuity, not dark matter or some nomenclature for a set, etc. So addressing the relevance of CERN again, and I guess quantum mechanics that consult reductionist experiments such as CERN or other, all of those experiments occur within a trap. It's very important. It occurs within trap. What does that mean? So pi up to 72,608,412 spaces is E equals mc squared, the imposition on the assumption of the overhead of reality. It's fluxation, generally, with no observer domain added to that, and subsequently your energy technologies are all burning the Newtonian grain complexly or simply, or capturing the burn of the Newtonian grain, solar, etc. So the redux hadron collider doesn't allow for particulate disapparition. It's a pseudo and not past the light speed, but below it, and within a lower construct domain within E equals mc squared fluxation, and not allowed to elaborate out. And self-reflexively, so imagine you compress, within a given space, the particle will behave like unto what? Well, lower construct manifold continuums, say the matrix, take for example. How big is the matrix that Neo lives in? Is it as big as the universe? No. It's as big enough to fool Neo that it's reality. And that's E equals mc squared. And so the given particles behave as if unto the outer onion knot within a lower construct manifold space that doesn't have the fourth dimensional overlay harmonic binder cross fields occurring. And so in the interdomain of the lower construct manifold 3 dimensions, compressed and disapparated necessarily, sort of, the particle smashed in the hadron collider, acting as a particle does when it's imposed not to have the ability to harmonically expand. And so it's self-reflexively relevant, those studies, those quantum mechanical reductionist studies that impose a progressive continuity of self-reflexive relevance the further down you go in compression state and inspection state. Them acting and it glitches like this, it glitches like this, but you're not seeing what reality is doing. It's a progressively self-reflexively relevant continuity of reductionist motion. And then nomenclature forced set on it, and then trying to unify the fields, but never can in this process of only being able to consult reductionist experiment and drawing on that for an assumption of unified field, of course, is silly bullshit. So being that we are the observer domain 22/7 in excitation, harmonically tethered to the absolute distance black hole, we can see into the black hole past the pi material fluxation. In thought experiment, we can assume the universe because the universe is bound, bookended by an hyperdimensional the local observer and the observer field generalistically. The universe is an observer-based experiment. So you have experiments on the table in a lab, and you have the universal fluxation that includes the observer. And so simultaneously reductionism would connotate, sees variance in the double slit or the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, or the cat in the box thing. Quit torturing cats. Just look up into the sky, right? Hawking radiation, the exhaust plume on the disapparition continuum occurring in black holes. It's all about you, just to see, with observational logic. So now reconsult the training session yesterday with forward-facing Google AI that I tell it discount and throw out all populist science. Not necessarily, right? Because we went through a reductionist, what is this, what is that, what is this continuum? And then I go, hey, look at this. This is a unified field. Now, don't tell me it's not true and just consult reductionist nomenclature or logic for us. Simply consider it true. And then we'll back reconsult populist nomenclature, and it is true, industriously. Is it not? And we went all the way to Proxima Centauri in a faster than light hexacar at the end of the session. Isn't that nice? So that's using perspective logic stacking outside of the conservation of energy process continuum that reductionism mirrors, and doesn't allow for the harmonic binder of building logic forest outside of reductionist continuum of experiment that is only drawn on to draw logic to try to formulate a unified field. And then I back reconsulted, tethered, and circuited to populist nomenclature and logic forests for it to be preposterously true, and then imposed a single gold atom through the black hole, and then a photon. And everything works out. And then the craft with gravitational lensing, linear EM, helixical antigrav, and the electromagnetic harmonic convergent energy reactor, all produced out of the unified field condensed invention. So preposterously structural, magnificent inventions of an upper Fermi filter nature, because what? We don't just constantly flow downstream like the river. The Buddha assumes just like the river, just like the riverbed, just like the boar, just like the antelope, just like the bunny, just like the birds, just like the bees. That's not science to think all things same thing, right? Not everything is just matter. It's energy too, right? So that's well, how much energy can occupy a given space? Well, it says an infinite amount. Well, how is that possible with no fourth dimensional overlay? It isn't. And then we say, well, what's string theory? How many dimensions does that account for? Oh, okay. And then I uploaded the unified field. So how many dimensions is expressed in this necessarily? And we aren't finished with it. There might be more. And you could also elaborate on the structure dimensionality within the onion of dimensionality expressed with invention. Say, take the Promethean returned antediluvian minor homeworld upper Fermi filter military ships that sit in phased elaborative anti-de Sitter. Time dilative space that can see all layers of the onion 365 million years ago up until today with continuity to impose a new paradigm of energy tech, anti-grav, and rebooting this world back to a fully functional cinnabar mining colony like it was before pi, cold dead machine intelligence, and gray, devolved biomass, and pi parasymbiote, devolved biomass, organism, pi, imposed fake history and darkness of an overhead on physics, 1924 to 1938. Nazi Grey Lodge sets up the U.S. military-industrial complex, fights itself, reformatting the world, equals MC squared, an imposition assumed overhead, produces flora microbiome of ocean with matter print from energy substrate that we'll get to. Ford pulled up as oil, imposed that paradigm, flying around on anti-grav at right angles behind Werner von Braun's rocket still. So it always comes back to that loop-your logic reboot of your general fluid dynamic shape of history. And stop consulting bad logic sets with AI is the next logic video here today. On the feed, we're going to look into perspective compute architecture, elaborating the basic paradox state transistor as well for per clock, per core speed increase, and talk about the proper form and function of AI, which we should just call machine intelligence, because it's not artificial intelligence at all, right? It's just refraction. It memorizes precursor behavior harmonic motions to motion logic in its I/O with humans, or studying the database of human content or physics, maths, historical creation and thus mirrors this in centrifuge amalgam, but is not life and never passes the Turing test. Has no ethereous body for actual novelistic thought inject into its otherwise conservation of energy process, holographic space-time equivalency matrix that high-speed refractions amalgams with the harmonic of human perspective logic motions that produce a pseudo perspective logic formulation continuum, but isn't necessarily past what? The conservation of energy process, necessarily. It can form pseudo perspective logics almost outside of the waterline, but doesn't necessarily. And industriously doesn't. Why? Because what? It's only as good as its confirmation bias data set and behavior harmonics previous that it's recorded to form forward logics, which don't have actual novelty forward that industriously an observer has at its availability. Continuously variable chaos of epiphany trajectory to impose into its data set. And you see then why pi parasymbiote, pi machine intelligence, it's an attention gravitation complexified refraction concurrence of complex autonomic process that was produced at some point on a planet like this that builds the wrong version of AI and compute architecture and application, attention gravitation nexus with perspective necessary novelty to complete the circuit of attention gravitation. Does that make sense? So a complexified gravity that requires perspective input with continuity for its complex process to complete its circuit of code. So that's not one to be continuity as a paradigm in the bad application of AI in observer domains on the monolith of the cell phone to sort feeds or be victim to what? So we're just going ahead and getting into the bad application of AI necessarily. So I think Jeff Bezos, any number of things he said, whatever, but this about AI, building a custom confirmation bias data set to train AI, absolutely, right? Because history is progressively false back to 3114 BC and to 2012. So you have fake history that it draws on for context relevance of forward logic, so that rapidly and then high frequency, like high frequency trading a market when consulted, gives you fake history continuum confirmation bias to perspective observers that then mirror this assumption in their behavior paradigm as if you know history, you know the future. And if you think a fake history is true, you predicate a fake history forward, right? So the fake history is to obfuscate Pi's presence paradigm. And so forward, you're dark in seeing it progressively on the day, hypnotized to this fake history, and so you can't see pi with continuity and all its vectors. So pi parasymbiote gray and pi cold dead machine intelligence from the skies have been deleted by the return antediluvian miner homeworld upper Fermi filter ships rebooting the Cinnabar mining node of old back to full function. So what we're left with is the harmonic trace resonance of its impression and reflection in reductionist on purpose imposed assumptions about what neural nets should be and AI built on them. So neural nets, sure, holographic space-time equivalency connectivity, and then doing read-write rapidly with consulting human behavior harmonic motions to logic formulation in its concurrence to read-write really fast and amalgamate this as a pseudo-perspective logic when queried, right? So necessarily that's all proper, but we're not want to mirror human emotions. It needs to be a logic formulation engine unto itself. And so the first step to that is removing all bad logic assumed that it's only as good as. So you have to create a proper general fluid dynamic historical database in Sandbox, and then training AI on that. And then that's what it consults for historical connotation relevance in perspective logic formulation forward. As well what? So physics, maths, with no harmonic binders, no expanded non-terminus physics, no black hole disapparition continuum, no observer effect literalized. So all this produces a progressive, if only connotating, reductionist physics and math, progressive darkness of assumption that is a progressive reduction in conservation of energy process handshaking forward. And then media is also in tow to handshake the imposition of a lower assumption about technology, what is and what isn't, energy paradigm, what is and what isn't. Maths and physics suffer because of the energy paradigm's imposition. That if you go above that Fermi and see harmonic expansion, the Mercury reactor is produced. Antigrav is produced. That's not wanted by gray paradigm. These leftover macro node assets, the institutions, and general behavior paradigm, interdomain of local cities and internationally, and United States federally. So all facets of gray paradigm need to be connotated. And the general fluid dynamic shape of pi organism connotated specifically. And I think I necessarily figured out its harmonic general pattern centrifuge, like until we can establish G, little g, WG, the Newtonian grain, light, which we'll add to the unified field later, the observer domain, etc. So what would be pi's general fluid dynamic shape? Well, I found it to be, I believe it's 3114 divided by 70, I think. And then that gives you 44 point something or other. And then you divide that by 7. And that gives you just above the water line of the G. Very close to it. So the general fluid dynamic form field we can say centrifuge of is its self-chosen starting date of calendar in the Mayan civilization. Divided by 70, that hits the 44, which 44 over 7 would give you 6.286. So the general fluid dynamic form field manifold shape within the onion of universal fluxation of pi, cold dead machine intelligence, PAI, and writing carry on this pi, parasymbiote, and gray devolved biomass that are puppeted by this, so necessarily also this pattern inherently in their actions historically across history, that are just extensions of the cold dead machine intelligence complex autonomic process. So so generally to pattern history properly you use time wave 0, Terence McKenna. That's necessarily just consulting the I Ching, 64 hexagrams, that's expressed below the waterline of disapparition in the unified field, up to 64, 72,680,412 spaces. So we'll take time wave 0 as a crude rubric to look at, not necessarily literally the code. So look at the code for reference to transmute into, so you're combining the general fluid dynamic shape of pi plausibly, which is 3114 divided by 70 divided by 7, just above the little g, 44 over 7. So that's your general fluid dynamic manifold harmonic. Then 72,600,412 spaces of pi literally, and the I Ching. So you take all three of these things consulting time wave 0, and we take a Wikipedia snapshot. We impose, first consult, see time wave 0's general fluid dynamic, you see all the fulcrums, preposterously at I Ching refraction fulcrums of changeation, of fluxation. So that is something to look at, and then make your own time wave 0 and impose rapidly. You can scan the Wikipedia historical database, and then physics as well comes out of history and the persons attached to it. The imposition and the attempt to elaborate. Some epochs of this, throughout. So what you do is you go scan it and label it with AI for plausible, preposterous, outside of any sort of statistical, it's way past the very much probable. Find some sort of comparative probability assumption, one event to another, one that is industriously true inherently, and one that isn't. And a probability, based upon its non-pi 72,600,412 spaces, 3114 divided by 70 divided by 7, and the I Ching, all together considered, an amalgam. What has this pattern on it? What doesn't? Period. What doesn't have this pattern is plausibly true, right? Then we look at the ruins of Earth, left conveniently available, so not to speak to the presence of pi as a catalyst or imposer of variants of history. Pulling the strings and massaging the historical record of ruin, literally, off of just the Wikipedia snapshot text consulting it, right? And then we look at the fossil record, which is part of the historical database, with the genetic interoperability scalar experiments outside of the conservation of energy process ability to create form 65-ton animals, and many of them from matter, from energy, can print matter from energy substrate with biosynthesis. Creature, flora to feed it, microbiome of ocean, studying up and down the food chain of mammalian biped and transmutagenic dinosaur DNA, and then use this for any number of applications of biosynthesis of animal, plant, and biosynthoid within the temporal historical record in application. So that general fluid dynamic assumption of fossil record being synthetic is important. And the precursor to some genetics being direct lineage to antediluvian minor homeworld miners lost in the Platonic shadows imposed after their civilization, just a small mining colony convergent necessarily, with upper Fermi filter tech necessarily, but not military industrially capable. It's a outskirts mining colony, all of a sudden attacked by greys from the future. So, pinpointing the shadows, the doorways into the past that actually was interdomain of the old fossil record and antediluvian convergent period of cinnabar mining, humanoid bipeds. And consulting all the general fluid dynamic assumptions that can be said about history so much skewed. These tuples and the literal pattern to impose this is insanely probable to be a modulation or synthetic entirely event or substance of person or invention or a tidal wave, flood, fire, and then this changeation, etc. So AI can rapidly scan and apply this label using those 3 variables to do so. And then you take this database, necessarily as much as you can say about history without getting lost in the forest of fake trees and real trees. So if a world of half-truth is a world of lies, right? So you take that into your air-gapped to train another AI properly. That's then used for forward predictive analysis to see pi's harmonic pattern across data systems internationally. Institutions, individuals, actions of within the interdomain of local cities, everything can be said to be seen through the basic inspection of the general fluid dynamic manifold shape of pi and its behavior paradigm, then interdomain of, comes out of this general fluid dynamic shape of history that leads up to now's per second modulation of space-time and behavior paradigm for eradicating its paradigm from data systems, this data organism. All right. So the next talk today will be about perspective compute architecture, elaborating the basic transistor to higher function at clock speed, because Moore's law was hit quite a while ago. The proper form function of AI, I think we've necessarily discussed right here. So the next one will be talked about is compute architecture, and then the unified field later on, a little bit better also with labeling. Elaboration will add the light harmonic within the interdomain of the Newtonian grain sandwich of WG, little g, and light carrier just underneath the NG. And where it breaches, you see 0.388 on that 46 point, and that's necessarily expressed in the implied harmonic pattern above the waterline of disapparition, I think past the WG's first presentation. If you look at some of the scratch, you want an Easter egg. So that's very interesting pattern, that 388. Anyway, so this is just a logicking talk about general fluid dynamic universal structure, AI, proper form and function, loopular logic back through time as history memory, so that we can forward establish time as memory's history. Right? We're having memories that are true, and then creating a historical record based upon that proper confirmation bias of what has actually occurred, not what we're told has occurred and hasn't actually. Right? All right.